Okay, so we're going live with number 2 of our focus on Jordan Peterson in the third year of the curriculum. Yesterday or last week, we watched the video. We had a little bit of commentary, but then we had an amazing discussion afterwards. So instead of having this be a 45-minute class like we had planned, we're going to do an hour and a half. But we're going to actually be doing all of the talking that we did in the unrecorded part. And we're not going to repeat what we said last time, but we're gonna have a lot more discussion this time than we did, since that all happened after the recording. So let's get into it. And this is where we left off. If you remember, he had just finished setting the backdrop for how to think in what I've been calling the mythopoetic way, but how to approach narrative correctly. And he had been making his pragmatic and Nietzschean points, and now he's going to start getting into Jung.
Freud, I suppose, in some sense, started to collate the information that we had pertaining to the notion that people lived inside a dream. You know, it was Freud who really popularized the idea of the unconscious mind. And we take this for granted to such a degree today that we don't understand how revolutionary the idea was. Like with what's happened with Freud is that we've taken all the marrow out of his bones, so to speak, and left the husk behind. And, you know, now when we think about Freud, we just think about the husk because that's everything that's being discarded. But so much of what he discovered is part of our popular conception now, including the idea that your perceptions and your actions and your thoughts are all, what would you say, informed and shaped by unconscious motivations that are not part of your voluntary control. And that's a very, very strange thing. It's one of the most unsettling things about the psychoanalytic theories, because the psychoanalytic theories are something like, you're a loose collection of living sub-personality with its own set of motivations and perceptions and emotions and rationales, all of that. And you have limited control over that. So you're like a plurality of internal personalities that's loosely linked into a unity. You know that because you can't control yourself very well, which is one of Jung's objections to Nietzsche's idea that we could create our own values. So Jung didn't believe that, especially not after interacting with Freud, because he saw that human beings were affected by things that were deeply, deeply affected by things that were beyond their conscious control.
All right, really quickly, let's start with a couple of fun things, because he's going to get into these things. But one of the really fun games to play sometimes is to try to sum up a great thinker in a single sentence, which of course you can't do fairly. That's the premise of the game, is not that it's fair, but to try to do it. And so he started going a little bit beyond Freud a second ago there, which is fine. He's going to clarify. But if we wanted to unfairly summarize Freud, or somebody say, give me one sentence about what Freud said that matters, it could be something as simple as, you're not actually aware of all the things you're thinking. It seems so obvious, and clearly there were ancient thinkers who understood that. But when he presented it in our society, it was like he listed it as one of his 2 insights that would forever make everything he said unacceptable to everybody. And it's funny to think that, because today we all just take that for granted. You know, from the time we're young, we understand we've heard the word unconscious or subconscious, and we're aware, we're just sort of living in the waters of that revelation. But at the time that he was advocating it, at least in his mind, he was trying to put forward something that there was great resistance for. And of course, it's obviously the case, right? I mean, here's how easy it is. If you are wondering if that's true, it's as easy as this. If I asked you what do 3 and 2 make, and you tell me 5, and I say, yeah, fantastic. And then I ask you the next question, which is, how did you do that? Well, you might have a story. Then you might believe the story of how you did it, but you have no idea how you did it. It could be that your story is, well, like a computer, I have a place for a number, and then I perform the additive operation with the other place of the other number when you ask me to do a sum, and then the answer comes back to my consciousness, says 5's the answer, and then I send that to the language system, and I tell you 5, and I report that that's what happened. But it could be, well, there's a tiny memorization circuit in my brain that was formed when I was a child and I learned how to count. And basically it's gotten very good at counting very quickly. So when you tell me what's 2 and 3, I just send those numbers down to that system, and it just counts 1, 2, and then it goes 3 more. So 3, 4, 5. And then when it's done counting with 3 more numbers, it returns the number to me. It's like, okay. Or it could be that I'm a social creature who's memorized answers to certain questions, and I know that's the right answer. So I'm not actually doing anything really mathematical at all. It's more of a language. It could be any of those, or it could be any of a million other possibilities, and you don't know. Like, you have no privileged access for looking into that part of your brain to know how your brain is doing something even that simple. So for anybody who's curious about whether or not that's the case, I mean, there's a way in which it's very obviously the case. Which also brings us to the fact that this isn't a new idea when Freud came up with it. It's not like there were great thinkers in the past who didn't understand this. But putting that aside, if we were to then sum up Jung, all right, so if Freud is going to say you have ideas that you don't want to realize, that you don't want to become aware of, these are subconscious ideas, these are ideas that are repressed, and Jung might say, well, you don't want to think the idea, but the idea is fully formed, and it's an idea, it's living in your brain, or I mean, it's stored in your brain, let's say, but you don't want to see it. So what happens is the dream sort of codes it in picture form so that you can kind of face it a little bit, but it's a fully formed idea. And if we were to take Jung and sum it up, he'd say, no, those ideas that are in your subconscious, they're not ideas, they're personalities. Their inclinations, their ways of being, their sub-personalities might be a better way of putting it. But they have different interests and different wills and different motivations, and you need to sort yourself out because you are a complicated pantheon of Mount Olympus. And if the gods are not in the right order, then it's going to be chaos and war. And you might think something like that. And so for Jung, the dream is not, I have an idea and it's a well-formed idea. It's more like, I don't exactly have the idea. It's not well-formed enough for me to put it into words. And so the only way to depict it is through images. As I start to become aware of it, to maybe if I dream enough, I'll be able to put it into concrete language. So in any case, the other comment to make is that, and it's not unfair that Peterson's doing this, and it's not an indication that he doesn't understand what I'm about to say. He may agree with it, he may disagree with it. But if anybody has the impression that, from what Peterson said, that Nietzsche thought it would be really easy for us to make up new values, he did not think that. He thought the price of being able to do that would be death. It was absolutely like a mythologically ancient death and rebirth, resurrection necessity. And his positing of the Übermensch was not to say some people are better. It was to say none of us are good enough. So we won't go into Nietzsche to try to be more fair to him because it's not really relevant exactly, but we'll just take note of that. All right, let's continue because we want to get into this. This is heavy, good stuff.
And no one really knows how to conceptualize those things. The cognitive psychologists think about them in some sense as computational machines. And the ancient people, I think, thought of them as gods, although it's more complex than that. Like rage would be a god. Mars, the god of rage, that's the thing that possesses you when you're angry. It has a viewpoint, and it says what it wants to say, and that might have very little to do with what you want to say when you're being sensible. And it doesn't just inhabit.
We should actually underline this too really quickly before we go on. If anybody's curious about that idea, you might ask yourself, have you ever noticed that you are a different person with your boss than you are with your wife? Right? The idea that you might be made up of different personalities and that maybe one is more in charge than another at different times. You might think of that as, well, that's an abstract kind of a metaphor, and it's more simple and objectively comprehensible than that. But it might not be. I mean, that you are a personality. That you manifest in a personal sort of way, and that your relationships, which are probably the most important things and should be in your life, are all between personalities. And so the idea that a personality might be the basic unit of what we have to consider when we're looking at what's going on in your subconscious might sound strange at first, but it should sound less strange when we start considering things like that. Okay.
Inhabit you, it inhabit.
Oh, I want to remind everybody that this is very different from the other classes that we do. And if anybody unmutes and says pause, I will immediately pause it and we will discuss anything. That's the way this is going to go. So
Inhabits everyone, and it lives forever, and it even inhabits animals. And so it's this transcendent psychological entity that inhabits the body politic, like a thought inhabits the brain. That's one way of thinking about it. Very strange. It certainly has its merits. And those things, well, in some sense, those are deities, although it's not that simple. And so Jung got very interested in dreams and started to understand the relationship between dreams and myths, because he would see in his clients' dreams echoes of stories that he knew because he was deeply read in mythology. And then he started to believe that the dream was the birthplace of the myth, and that there was a continual interaction between the two processes, the dream and the story, and storytelling. And well, you tend to tell your dreams as stories when you remember them. And some people remember dreams all the time, like 2 or 3 a night. I've had clients like that, and they often have archetypal dreams that have very clear mythological structures. I think that's more the case with people who are creative, by the way, especially if they're a bit unstable at the time, because the dream tends to occupy the space of uncertainty and to concentrate on fleshing out the unknown reality before you get a real grip on it. So it's like the dream is the birthplace of thinking. That's a good way of thinking about it. And so because it's the birthplace of thinking, it's not that clear. It's doing its best to formulate something. That was Jung's notion, as opposed to Freud, who believed that there were sensors, internal sensors, that were hiding the dream's true message. That's not what Jung believed. He believed the dream was doing its best to express a reality that was still outside of fully articulated conscious comprehension. It was, because you think, look, a thought appears in your head, right? That's obvious. Bang, it's nothing you ever ask about. But what the hell does that mean? A thought appears in your head. What kind of ridiculous explanation is that? It just doesn't help with anything. Where does it come from? Well, nowhere. It just appears in my head. Okay, well, that's not a very sophisticated explanation, as it turns out, And so you might think that those thoughts that you think, well, where do they come from? Well, they're often someone else's thoughts, right? Someone long dead, that might be part of it, just like the words you use to think are utterances of people who've been long dead. And so you're informed by the spirit of your ancestors. That's one way of looking at it. And your motivations speak to you, and your emotions speak to you, and your body speaks to you. And it all does all that, at least in part, through the dream. And the dream is the birthplace of the fully articulated idea. They don't just come from nowhere fully fledged, right? They have a developmental origin, and God only knows how lengthy that origin is. Even to say something like, I am conscious, that's taken. Chimpanzees don't say that. It's been 7 million years since we broke from chimpanzees, something like that, from the common ancestor. They have no articulated knowledge at all. They have very little self-representation in some sense, and very little self-consciousness. And that's not the case with us at all. And we had to painstakingly figure all of this out during that, 7 million year voyage. And I think some of that's represented and captured in some sense in these ancient stories, which I believe were part of, especially the oldest stories in Genesis, which is the stories we're going to start with.
Okay, this was a good idea for us to study, Peter. This is some heavy stuff, no? This is exciting. So what he's starting to suggest here is that there's a way that we can approach narrative. You think of narrative, you think of a fiction, like, is Hamlet real? Well, was there an Elsinorian dynasty with a young princeling who uttered the phrase to be or not to be? That's one way that you might interpret the question, is Hamlet true, or is it real, or does it have truth, or something like that. But that's not a very profound way of being real. It's possible that fictional characters are more real than flesh and blood people. That sounds really strange. We usually think of real as something I can point to. It has a location, length, breadth, and width. It's in a spot. But if personalities are what we are, then ways of being are. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mark. You just unmuted.
No, I'm just agreeing with you.
Okay,
can you
we'll
hear me all right?
continue. And yeah. Go ahead and interject at any time. Okay, so one of the things that we're most blind to in our scientism age is the subject, the character, the personality. And the reason why, of course, is that in order to do science, we have to banish all consideration of the subjective from the start. And we have to have this illusion that it's possible for us to have a perspective outside the universe, which of course we can't do. And the latest developments of science are inevitably doing what was predictable ahead of time, which is coming to a point where they say, well, the act of observing disturbs the observed. And this is, we're reaching a limit of what we can do with this fiction. But for some reason, we still live in the fiction that it's not a fiction, and that, yeah, it's a powerful fiction, right? We're making fictions on equal playing field here. We're not saying, therefore, science is ridiculous. What we're saying is it's not on a higher playing field than anything else that's mythologically underpinned. And the mythological underpinning of a scientific attitude is that you could pretend to have the post-Cartesian Christian ex nihilo perspective of God, that you could stop being a part of the universe and look at it only. Well, that isn't actually available to you. So there's an understanding from philosophy, and Nietzsche had this understanding, and ancient philosophers had this understanding. It's not like we just had to discover this now that science showed up. That is not, ultimate truth cannot be found in that direction. But we live in this scientism age where we think that would be ultimate truth. And so we say, well, if something's real, I can throw a rock at it. If something's real, it registers on my machine. And fictional characters don't, or the way they do is very, very indirectly by, maybe uh, group psychology, put 1,000 people in an MRI machine and see what lights up when they read Hamlet or something like that. I mean, it's certainly not very direct to say King Lear was real in that sense, or the character of King Lear in Shakespeare was real. However, there's a completely different way of approaching the cosmos, the narrative language, and this is what Jung was onto, the mythopoetic, the ancient religious traditions, to say, look, you're reading this the wrong way. You're reading these stories as if they're trying to be scientifically accurate when they're trying to be something infinitely more profound than that. And what they're doing is, of course, and it's not wrong for science to do what it does. It's the only way you can do science, and science is very powerful. Again, I'm not saying let's throw out science, but what they're doing is the exact opposite of what science does. It says, let's start with the subject. Let's start with the character. Let's recognize that each individual, even though we can't publish it in a way in a paper where other people can see the evidence of it, each individual has to run the experiment to say, you know what? It's like being someone. It's like being a character being in this world. And I can recognize that truth about myself. And why would I presume the opposite about everything else, rather than say, okay, if that's what I know most intimately is it's like to be in the world, then it's like being a character, and it's like being in a story. And those are that's the language of narrative, and it's the antithetical language to the scientific approach, which says banish all consideration of subjective from the beginning. It's saying build everything on the subjective. Again, we're not trying to pick one over the other. We're trying to say that maybe these need to communicate with each other. Maybe there's relevance and significance in this narrative language. So as he's setting the backdrop for approaching the scriptures, he's saying, look, there's ways we could read this that might not be as fruitful as other ways. And because we're living in this scientism age, I'm gonna make the point, and he's going to spend like 9 hours making this point as he gets into the first chapter of Genesis, which is pretty cool. But he needs to, and he needs to be, because we're learning not just about the stories or about his perspective, we're learning about ourselves and what it takes for us to have this understanding of, okay, I can choose to approach it with the fiction that I'm outside the universe, and I can do science, and that's fantastic. But I could also be approaching it in this other direction. And it's not illicit to do so, because I have all the evidence I need that it's like something to be in the world. And the language for talking about characters inside a story is narrative. So if there's going to be a lot of narrative in the scriptures, there's philosophy in the scriptures, there's even science occasionally. I mean, we can give examples of Solomon said the rivers constantly run into the sea, and yet the ocean never overflows. So he made an observation. He said, rivers are always flowing into the ocean, but the ocean isn't filling up. And then he said, the place from which the waters flow in the river, to there they return again. So he identified the water cycle through doing observations of physical events, right? So, I mean, there's a little bit of science in the Bible. Like, there are thinkers. It's not like that's not the right way to think sometimes about certain questions. But he's going to say, Peterson's trying to set the stage and say, look, if you're trying to read every verse of the Bible that way, you might be missing out on the most profound way that things can be true, and what the Bible, or, because we're going to be focusing on Genesis here, but what mythopoetic texts might be trying to tell us. And so we kind of have to do that, because no matter how religious we are, we still have this post-Cartesian scientism age perspective that, well, if it was really true, it would be objectively true. I could point to it and it would be a thing that's right there. Well, maybe Zeus isn't that kind of a thing, right? Maybe the way you wrestle with God is an important, maybe the idea of wrestling with God is some of the most profound and important things for you to consider as a character and a person going through life. And maybe this set of stories is about telling you how to do that in a way where you get a blessing. And maybe it's okay to think that way to get that truth. And you don't have to say, yeah, but could I point to the God that's doing the wrestling or something like that? Maybe you can and maybe you can't. The point is that seems much less important than the way it was understood as it was written, and the way it's been understood mostly by people who've been reading it before. We're in this weird blind age that we're in, where we act as though science, which is also based on a fiction that you could be outside the universe, it's not accurate. Or if it, I mean, it's not accurate for any person, at least. That's somehow superior to other um, characterological and fictional. I shouldn't say fictional because we still think of it pejoratively. Narrative-based language. So anyway, that's um, so to round up what I was saying earlier, how is it possible that Bugs Bunny could be more real than you and I? Well, if he's because there's a fictional character, let's make it easier. How about King Lear? How about Oedipus? Is Oedipus less real because I
because
can't shake his
they
hand?
represent something that's, excuse me, yes, sorry. Yeah, because they
So
represent something that's true to the human experience, to every one of us.
they certainly are a representation and a depiction because it's art, right? Yeah, so for sure. Um, but exactly the second part of what you said is hitting the nail on the head, right? Like, absolutely. Like, this is what it's like to be in the world. And if I tell you my biography, it'll give you some idea of what it's like to be in the world. But what if I told you the biography of a character who is manifesting the true and important parts of 10 billion people's biographies? Right? What if I've sucked out what's important about every individual story, and I found the story that all of those are getting close to, and then I called that King Lear or Hamlet or Oedipus or something like that? That's
Right.
okay. Okay. Well, that might be more real. And he also made a similar point about the gods. It's like, well, wait a minute. Have you ever noticed that? Have you ever, of course you have. Have you ever heard the phrase, what happened to you, man? You're not yourself today. If somebody flies into a rage, do they look like themselves in the moment that they're in a rage? Or rather, do they not look like any other person in the moment that that person is in a rage? It's almost like the most straightforward way of talking about what it's like to be a human in the world is to say, well, there are these other personalities that sort of float above us, in the sense that when we as individuals die, they remain. And they can possess us at times, and we look very different, and we act and talk differently, and we do things towards different ends than we ever normally would when we're not possessed by rage. And uh well, that seems like a pretty straightforward, accurate way of describing what it's like to be in the world, but that requires the narrative of ancient Greek mythology and say, okay, there's ways of being that are not me in the normal sense of how I usually act, that I totally manifest from time to time. And when I do, I might come out of it and go, oh God, I can't believe I acted like that or something, right? It's like, how can you have thoughts like that? How can you say, or Venus, right? Or lust. It's like you wake up in the morning, you go, oh God, that party last night. I can't believe I made such a fool of myself. It's like, well, how is it that you can be the person doing something and the person who's also saying, what the fuck got into me? How was I thinking that way? Like, that's ridiculous, right? And it's like, well, how do you the most straightforward way of describing that might be to say that there are patterns of being in the world that are playing a role, an evolutionary role. Like they're playing a creative role in our ancient past, and they're playing a role in our social interactions. They're playing a role in our individual psychologies. And if we're not aware of them and making the right propitiations and sacrifices and learning how to relate to and navigate and tame and work with these things, then we are just the playthings for them. They're more real than we are, in a sense. Again, it's hard to hear that in our age and not think, oh, but they're not like, I'm going to go climb Mount Olympus and I'm going to prove that there's no character like that standing on a certain rock. It's like, yeah, you can do that. But that doesn't make me think that this type of approach isn't obviously a more helpful revelation for what it's like to be in the world than anything else. And if the Jungian psychologists are correct that at the base of what's going on in your brain are personalities playing things out, that means you're never going to reduce it to something that's just this neuron was firing. It's not like this is a good fill-in story. That's the other point to make, is that from this approach, some of these thinkers are saying, look, this isn't a good fill in the blank story until we get a scientific explanation. We know ahead of time we're not going to get an explanation about what it's like to be in the world and ways of being in the world from a discipline that at its first move has to banish all consideration of ways of being. You're never going to get an answer from that approach. So it's not like we're saying, well, for now we'll fill it in with narratives and stories, but eventually we'll have a science of it. It's more like, and you know, people can disagree with that you might think it's exactly that, and that's fine. But from like these Jungian types, this is the science of understanding how to move from point A to point B as a character in the world is the study of narrative, and the greatest narratives are the mythopoetic and religious and prophetic and potentially revelatory stories. So I'm going to shut up if anybody else has anything to say, and then we'll go back to the video.
That they were, that some of the archaic nature of the human being is encapsulated in those stories, and it's very, very instructive as far as I can tell. I can give you just a quick example. You know, there's an idea of sacrifice in the Old Testament, and it's pretty barbaric. You know, I mean, the story of Abraham and Isaac is a good example of that, because Abraham is called on to actually sacrifice his own son, which doesn't really seem like something that a reasonable God would ask you to do, right? And the God in the Old Testament is frequently cruel and arbitrary and demanding and paradoxical, and which is one of the things that really gives the book life, because it wasn't edited by a committee, you know, a committee that was concerned with not offending anyone, that's for sure. So Jung believed that the dream was the birthplace of thought. And I've been extending that idea, because one of the things I wondered about deeply was, you know, you have a dream and then someone interprets it. And you can argue about whether or not an interpretation is valid, just like you can argue about whether your interpretation of a novel or movie is valid, right? It's a very difficult thing to determine with any degree of accuracy, which accounts in part for the postmodern critique. But my observation has been that people will present a dream, and sometimes we can extract out real useful information from it that the person didn't appear to know. And they get a flash of insight, and to me that's a marker that we've stumbled on something that unites part of that person that wasn't united before. It pulls things together, which is often what a good story will do, or sometimes a good theory. You know, things snap together for you, and there's a little light goes on, and that's one of the markers that I've used for accuracy in dreams. And I know in my own family, when I was first married, you know, I'd have fights with my wife, arguments about this and that. And I'm fairly hot-headed, and so I'd get all puffed up and, you know, agitated about whatever we were arguing about, and she'd go to sleep, which was really annoying, you know, so annoying. Because I couldn't sleep, right? I was like chewing off my fingernails, and she'd be like sleeping peacefully beside me. It's like maddening. So, but often she'd have a dream, you know, and then the next morning she'd discuss it with me, and then we could unravel what was at the bottom of our argument. And that was unbelievably useful, even though it was extraordinarily aggravating. So, you know, I was convinced by Jung. It looked to me like his ideas about the relationship between dreams and mythology and drama and literature made sense to me, and the relationship between that and art. I know this native carver, he's a Kwakwaka'wakw guy. He's carved a bunch of wooden sculptures, totem poles, and masks that I have in my house. And he's a very interesting person, not literate, not particularly literate, and really still steeped in this ancient 13,000-year-old tradition. He's original language speaker. And the fact that he isn't literate has sort of left him with the mind of someone who's pre-literate. And pre-literate people aren't stupid, they're just not literate. So their brains are organized differently in many ways. And I've asked him about his intuition for his carvings. And he's told me that he dreams, like you've seen the Haida masks, you know what they look like. Well, his people are closely related to the Haida, so it's the same kind of style. He said he dreams in those animals and can remember his dreams. And he also talks to his grandparents who taught him how to carve in his dreams. Quite often, if he runs into a problem with carving, his grandparents will come and he'll talk to them. But he sees the creatures that he's going to carve living in an animated sense in his imagination. And I mean, it's not that difficult. First of all, I have no reason to disbelieve him. He's a very, very straightforward person, and he doesn't have the motivation or the guile, I would say, in some sense, to invent a story like that. There's just no reason he would possibly do it. I don't think he's told that many people about it. He thinks it's kind of crazy, you know. He said when he was a kid, he thought he was insane because he'd had those dreams all the time about these creatures and so forth. And so it wasn't something he was trumpeting. But I found it fascinating because I can see in him part of the manifestation of this unbroken tradition. We have no idea how traditions like that are really passed along for thousands and thousands of years, right? Part of it's oral and memory, part of it's acted out and dramatized, and then part of it's going to be imaginative. And people who aren't literate, they store information quite differently than we do. We don't remember anything. It's all written down in books, right? But if you're from an oral culture, especially if you're trained in that way, you have all of that information at hand, both so you can speak it, you can tell the stories, and you really know them. And you know, modern people don't really know what that's like anymore. Doubt if there's more than maybe two of you in the audience that could spout from memory like a 30-line poem. You know, and poetry was written so that people could do that. That's why we have that form, is so that people could remember it and have it with them. And we don't do any of that anymore. Anyways, back to Jung. Jung was a great believer.
Let's pause on that. Being able to say poetry is a really, really good thing, and we should all make that a discipline again in our own lives. And like you said, poetry is written to make that easy. And it is easier than you think it is. If you don't think you have a great memory, just read the same poem 20 times and discover that it's written in your brain now. And it'll stanzas, if it's a good poem, will arise and pop up in your brain unbidden at moments where they're useful. We should all be doing more of that. Putting that aside, he's introducing the possibility of approaching narrative in a way that's reasonable and proper, perhaps, but also in a way that could actually extract some meaning, truth, value out of it. One of the qualities, I just want to make a side point here that I think is useful, is that there's consequences to this idea that the language, the narrative language that we're using, starts with character. It starts with the subject. Then the subject has an aim, and then the subject has obstacles that block him from getting to his aim. And then the journey, that's a story. A story is, here's a guy, he's at point A, he wants to get to point B. Here's what happens along the way. So one of the things to understand about it, since it starts with personality, since it starts with character, if you look inside yourself and you say, yeah, I feel like a character. I know that I'm a mass of molecules. That's what I'm supposed to say in the age that we live in. Sure, I'm not going to deny that, but it's not what it feels like. What it feels like is that I'm a certain kind of being with aims, and I'm hoping to make it to a certain destination. I'm not even sure what that destination is. Something like that. Okay. One of the really cool things about it, since it starts with that, is that the way you get to know the characters in a story is when they smash up against each other, right? This is why love and relationship is kind of at the base of everything, but it's also why I think the ancient mythopoets, the Greek mythology, the Christian, all of these, the ancient Egyptian, why we say, oh, we laugh at them. We say, oh, they personified everything. Well, they're trying to know it on a really personal, intimate level, and there's no way of doing that otherwise. So, oh, they're personifying nature. They don't understand what really makes the wind blow. They don't know how to think scientifically, which of course they did, They just weren't that interested in thinking in that way. They were more interested in thinking, okay, what is relevant to the personality, and what is relevant to the personality from nature. What's most relevant is the personality, the personal forces that are true of your external environment, or of your environment, let's just say, right? So the way that the way that these ancient religious texts are approaching us and approaching the subject is saying, okay, you you as a personality need to know how to relate to nature properly, how to relate to the divine properly, how to relate to the cosmos properly, how to relate to the species, the body politic properly, how to relate to the family properly, right? It's all relational at its base, because that's the way a personality can interact with something, right? If it was starting with you're a mass of molecules, it would be looking for well, those might fundamentally be relational too, by the way, if this other language is more profound and a foundation for that scientific. One of the ways to think about the scientific approach is to say it cartoonifies the world, it simplifies it, and then it does really powerful things with those simplifications. But the less simplified way of looking at it is to say, well, I know that I am a personality, so talk to me in a language about personalities. So the characters, one of the ways you get to discover what the character is that they smash up against another character, and then the sparks that fly are only the things that are different about their characters, and that's what illuminates the nature of their characters, because the things that are the same don't get noticed, but the things that are different, that's where the sparks, that's where the light starts coming from. And then another thing that often happens is you'll take one character and you'll smash them up against this thing in reality, this natural principle or this personal force in the cosmos. And then you'll have another story with a different character smash up against the same thing. And so now you see different sparks flying, and you're starting to learn about the characters in that way. Okay. So what I'm really trying to highlight here is simply the fact that we objectify everything in our, again, post-Cartesian scientism era. That's what we do. We assume it's the right thing to do, and then we laugh at people who personify things. But we know most intimately that we are personalities. So we might say, okay, we are objectifying things now rather than the ancients were personifying things, right? I don't think they were going out of their way to personify things. And it's very clear from our studies of ancient thinkers, they knew how to think scientifically too, to some degree. Like they understood what it would mean to come up with like a universal explanation for like principles that regulate certain events. They just weren't interested in those answers as much as they were interested in why did that specific thing happen right now in my story, the way it's playing itself out. So there's a broader lecture there, but we won't give it now because we've given it in other places, and we'll just go back to this. But so far, that was clear enough what I was saying, or should I make it a little clearer? Let's get back to hearing from Peterson.
Believer in the dream, and I noted that dreams will tell you things that you don't know. And then I thought, well, how the hell can that be? How that in the world can something you think up tell you something you don't know? How does that make any sense? First of all, why don't you understand it? Why does it have to come forth in the form of the dream? It's like there's something going on inside you that you don't control, right? The dream happens to you just like life happens to you. I mean, there is the odd lucid dreamer who can, you know, apply a certain amount of conscious control, but most of the time it's you're laying there asleep, and this crazy complicated world manifests itself inside you, and you don't know how. You can't do it when you're awake, and you don't know what it means. It's like, what the hell is going on? And that's one of the things that's so damn frightening about the psychoanalysts, because you get this both from Freud and Jung. You really start to understand that there are things inside you that are happening that control you instead of the other way around. You know, there's a bit of reciprocal control, but there's manifestations of spirits, so to speak, inside you that determine the manner in which you walk through life. And you don't control it. And what does? Is it random? You know, there are people who have claimed that dreams are merely the consequence of random neuronal firing, which is a theory I think is absolutely absurd, because there's nothing random about dreams. You know, they're very, very structured, and very, very complex. And they're not like snow on a television screen or static on a radio. Like those things are complicated. And then also I've seen so often that people have very coherent dreams that have a perfect narrative structure. Now they're fully developed in some sense. And so that just doesn't, that theory just doesn't go anywhere with me. I just can't see that as useful at all. And so I'm more likely to take the phenomena seriously, say, well, there's something to dreams. Well, you dream of the future and then you try to make it into a reality. That seems to be an important thing. You know, or maybe you dream up a nightmare and try to make that into a reality, because people do that too if they're hell-bent on revenge, for example, and full of hatred and resentment. I mean, that manifests itself in terrible fantasies. You know, those are dreams, then people go act them out. These things are powerful, you know, and whole nations can get caught up in collective dreams. That's what happened to the Nazis. That's what happened to Nazi Germany in the 1930s. It was absolutely remarkable, amazing, horrific, destructive spectacle. And the same thing happened in the Soviet Union. The same thing happened in China. It's like, we have to take these things seriously, you know, and try to understand what's going on. So Jung.
I'm really glad he made that point here. Yesterday in our 101 course, this is the third year stuff for those joining, but in our more basic 101 course, we read an essay by an individual who suggested that, you know, perhaps the explanation for the Nazis is that they weren't aimed at the good to begin with. And I knew that he didn't do much in that essay to flesh out how that could be possible in a way that would be convincing. But I was thinking of Peterson and thinking, man, we're going to get to him making that argument. And he's saying, you know, I think Jung had this idea that people have ideas is maybe backwards. It might be more true that ideas have people. I remember a novel by Milan Kundera. Actually, all of his novels were like masterpieces, and then this was his masterpiece of masterpieces in my estimation, and it's called Immortality. And in it, it's quite a clever novel in a lot of ways. And I shouldn't have used the word clever. It's clever in all of the non-pejorative senses. So a better word, it's brilliant. It's a brilliant novel. But in it, he does some really impressive literary techniques. And one of them is to have one of the main characters in the novel be a real person. Okay, so here's how it starts. The narrator is talking to you about his attempt to write the novel that you're about to read. So he says, I'm sitting here in a public pool and I see a woman and she waves. She like turns over her back and she gives this gesture with her hands, this little gesture of a wave, a wink, a curl. I don't know what it was, but some sort of a wave. And he says, in that moment was born my main character. It just all captured by that one gesture. And then he says, you know, how many gestures are there? How many ways of giving physical expression to communicate things are there? Like 10,000, 1,000, 50? Like how many of these things exist? And how many people are there? Like 10 billion, 9 billion, 5 billion, whatever it is at the time he's writing. And he says, okay, so there's a lot more people than there are gestures. Do people have gestures or do gestures have people? Right? This gesture, this way of expressing something in the world, it's not hers. She saw it as a little girl and she manifested it, right? It's more like the gesture itself, this very embodied simple meme or simple idea of communication has a life of its own, and it's picking people, or people are agreeing to be possessed by it or to relate to it or to manifest it or something. But the gesture seems more real than the people in a sense, because the individual person can die, but 10 other people who saw her make that can pick up on it and make the same gesture. So he goes in, that's his fun philosophical exploration as he starts inventing this character. And while he's, you know, this is a side note, but while he's sitting there trying to come up with the novel that he's writing, that you're reading, he's waiting for a friend of his. And so he's waiting for a friend of his to show up, who it turns out at the end of the book is a fictional character in the book. And there's things that he's interacting with these other characters in a way that makes it clear that he's absolutely in their world. And then the narrator wasn't really sitting there waiting for a friend, or he was sitting there waiting for a friend, and then that friend showed up. But then so what ends up happening, this is a side note, but what's so clever about this technique is that the question, what is real, all of the potential answers to that question when you're engaged in the novel. Right, to engage in a work of art is to suspend disbelief, and then you watch cartoon mermaids sing about living up on the land, and it's like, well, that's ridiculous, but you're totally engrossed in it because it's a narrative and it's speaking to you about what it's like to be, and so it's very easy. The fact that it's very easy to get caught up in a narrative is strange, except that maybe that's what it's more like to be, and it's talking to us about something really important. And so even if we can't put it into words, even if we couldn't extract the meaning from the story and put it into propositional statements, or even if we couldn't make an account for why it is that we spend so much money and we're so mesmerized by these stories, the fact that we are and can't explain it might be a hint of evidence that they are deeply profound, or at least they're the language of the deeply profound. Okay, what's interesting about this novel, and I'll just wrap up this side point because it's not really that important or relevant to what we're here to discuss, is that all of the questions of trying to figure out what's real in the novel are so fruitless to pursue that your brain, if you try to pursue them, eventually just gives up on it. And so the novel sort of won't allow you to sit down and think, oh, that's just a story. Because if you get into the story, it sort of it's very cleverly hot wires the parts of your brain that would try to understand it as a story, and you're just left with characters that mattered to you through the story and no way of really putting them in a category of, yeah, but that's just Bugs Bunny, that's just Hamlet, it's not really real. I mean, anyway, that's a side note, but the point about the gesture is very much an analogous, that Milan Kundera was making in the beginning of that novel is very much the same point. Actually, it's more than analogous to this idea that Jung had, that ideas have people rather than people having ideas. And we like to think of ourselves as, I am this thing and here's all the things I'm doing. But what Peterson is saying, well, you're not controlling your dream. And then he says something really interesting. He says, and your dream reveals things to you that you don't know. What? How the hell is that possible? Like, it's your brain, isn't it? Your brain is telling you something in an encoded way. And then if you examine it correctly, you can have a flash of revelation and realize, oh, this is how I'm being an idiot, or this is the thing I need to face, or whatever, so that I can stop, tripping myself up and messing up my life. If I'll just look at this as the monster that needs to be said, I'm ignoring it. And this is the outcome if I don't conquer over it, or this is the prize I could possibly win if I do, or something. How is it that you cannot know that, go to sleep, and have your own brain tell it to you in that narrative sort of a way? And he's saying, okay, I don't know what we're going to make of dreams, but they're not random firings of the brain. And this brings us to, and so why is he talking about dreams so much? Well, Jung is saying, okay, if we made a law that every single person on earth had to write a novel in the next week, and I wrote a novel and you wrote a novel, we all wrote a novel, what's the likelihood that any of our novels would be worth reading? Probably not very good. I wouldn't inflict my novel, whatever I had to put out there, on anybody, right? Just don't read it, is what I would say. Well, that's because some of us are better dreamers than others. But there are some people who write really powerful novels. Really, they stick around. They become a part of the canon. Everybody who is interested in trying to figure out how to live a good life, and they talk to young people in educational settings to say, hey, you're looking for something to read. That Shakespeare guy, that's worth taking a look at. Those ancient Greeks and their plays, that's maybe even better. Like, why? Why do those things emerge? Hey, here's some Moby Dick. Here's some whatever. This is a good book. Dostoevsky. Well, why those books? There were a million books for every one of those that were written, and we all just sort of ignored them and they died. That almost happened to Moby Dick until it was rediscovered, actually. But in any case, what is it? Well, maybe they're just better dreamers. And so for the Jungian types, what they're saying is this dream world and this mythology world, they look an awful lot alike in a lot of different ways. And, one of the ways you can do that is say, okay, look at this ancient Egyptian painting. I should pull this up since this is what we're talking about. I'm not sure if I'll find it quickly enough, so I won't waste our time. But there's this ancient Egyptian painting about the god Ra, and it's this long-legged, stilty-looking, like cow structure with a long body. So it represents the firmament, even though it's a cow. That's pretty freaking weird. It's kind of overarching, like it's protective, but it's defining the ground beneath it. And like we live in this realm underneath this principle, this thing. And in that same painting, there's 4 other depictions of Ra, or 3 other ones. And he's depicted in different ways as different creatures in the exact same painting. You go, okay, is this insanity? Nothing in the world looks like that, we might say at first. But then we could say, well, my dreams don't follow temporal spatial restrictions either. The logic of a dream makes total sense narratively. But when I wake up, it's like, oh, it doesn't make sense. How did I get there? And then I was being chased. And then all of a sudden I was in this room and I was crying with somebody about something. It's like, and then we had to build a go-kart together, and it was hard because we couldn't find the parts that we needed. And we knew that somebody was hiding them. It's like, okay, you just all of a sudden in different settings. And then we were in China because we knew that all of that go-kart stuff had to do with being able to accomplish something in a four, but nobody spoke our language. It's like, okay, that dream sounds pretty freaking crazy, but emotionally and psychologically, it can be. I mean, maybe I just made up one that's nothing like a real dream, but a dream can be like that in the sense of not following cause and effect, temporal, spatial laws that we understand in our waking life to expect of the physical world. It doesn't follow those at all, and yet it could still be profoundly meaningful and saying something to us. And so for the Jungian types, the artist is just a really good dreamer. And I've interviewed different artists, and we're going to have one on here at some point. And I've asked her, I said, okay, this is really impressive art. We're going to actually bring her art on and just talk about it for hours. And we're going to get it set up so that people can purchase it and stuff. But I've had the pleasure of interviewing her for a number of years and having conversations with her and saying, okay, so um, I tried not to give her the answer, so it's very hard, but I was trying to ask her, I was like, okay, so what's it like? Like you're trying to find the right way to brush and to create this shape and this form. And how is it that you decide on that? And what she described was basically like the shape sort of exists. And what she's trying to do is stop getting in the way of being able to see it, right? So she's like, she even said that she like almost goes into a trance right before she gets it. Like it's just sort of like, I got to turn off my conscious brain entirely until I see what it's supposed to look like. And then suddenly I know exactly how to move my hand. And then I've got that shape that I need as a part of the painting. In any case, Jung's, so hopefully we'll be doing that soon and that'll be really fun. But Jung's idea and the book that I recommended to Alana, because Alana has a very interesting theory that that's essentially what all of life is like. It's like our attempts to get to enlightenment is very much doing the work that the artist is doing in a sense, but with our own conscious ideas. So you should check out that book by Langer, whatever one I sent you, the Feeling Informed book. Suzanne Langer. In any case, she's very much in the Jungian tradition, and for the Jungians, it's like, okay, look, the prophet is a really, really good dreamer, right? The artist is a really good dreamer, and the revelatory prophet who's getting revelation to tell us what it's like to be in the world and what God is like and how we have to relate to him. That's like the 1 in a billion of the 1 in a billion good dreamers. But what they're doing is they're getting in touch with what's been sown into us as we've been created in the image of something that as we've emerged as the product, if we want to do a William Jamesian radical embrace of Darwinism, as we manifest the definition of what we are, which is emerging as the product of everything else around us, taking away the things that don't fit in well with it. And it left us with personality, as if personality was a part of the shaping forces of what we had to fit in with. All right. That's enough of a side note.
Believed that the dream could contain more information than was yet articulated. You think artists do the same thing, like people go to museums and they look at paintings, Renaissance paintings or modern paintings, and they don't exactly know why they're there. I was in this room in New York. I don't remember which museum, but it was a room full of Renaissance art, great painters, the greatest painters. And thought maybe that room was worth $1 billion or something outrageous because there was like 20 paintings in there, you know, so priceless. And the first thing is, well, why are those paintings worth so much? And why is there a museum in the biggest city in the world devoted to them? And why do people from all over the world come and look at them? What the hell are those people doing? One of them was of the Assumption of Mary, you know, beautifully painted, absolutely glowing work of art. And there's like 20 people standing in front of it looking at it and think, what are those people up to? You know, they don't know. Why did they make a pilgrimage to New York to come and look at that painting? It's not like they know. Why is it worth so much? I mean, I know there's a status element to it too, but that begs the question, why do those items become such high status items? What is it about them that's so absolutely remarkable? Well, we're strange creatures. So I was trying to figure out in part, well, where did the information that's in the dream come from? Because it has to come from somewhere, and you could think about it as a revelation, you know, because it's like it springs out of the void and it's new knowledge and it's a revelation. You didn't produce it, it just appears. But that's, see, one of the things I want to do with this series is, like, I'm scientifically minded and I'm quite a rational person, and I like to have an explanation for things that's rational and empirical before I look for any other kind of explanation. And I don't want to say that everything that's associated with divinity can be reduced in some manner to biology or to an evolutionary history or anything like that. But insofar as it's possible to do that reduction, I'm going to do that. And I'm going to leave the other phenomena floating in the air because they can't be pinned down. And in that category, I would put the category of mystical or religious experience, which we don't understand at all. So artists observe one another. They observe people and they represent what they see, and they transmit the message of what they see to us, and they teach us to see. And we don't necessarily know what it is that we're learning from them. But we're learning something, or at least we're acting like we're learning something. We go to movies, we watch stories, we immerse ourselves in fiction constantly. That's an artistic production. And for many people, the world of the arts is a living world, and that's particularly true if you're a creative person. And it's the creative, artistic people that do move the knowledge of humanity forward, and they do that with their artistic productions first. They're on the edge, and the dancers do that, and the poets do that, and the visual artists do that, and the musicians do that, and we're not sure what they're doing. Like, we're not sure what musicians are doing. What the hell are they doing? Why do you like music? You know, it gives you a deep intimation of the significance of things. And no one questions it. You go to a concert, you're thrilled. It's a quasi-religious experience, particularly if the people really get themselves together and get the crowd moving. You know, there's something incredibly intense about it, but it makes no sense whatsoever. It's not an easy thing to understand. Music is deeply patterned, and patterned in layers, and I think that has something to do with.
All right, we're going to finish his exploration for explanation for music before we wrap this up. But he, there's so much to talk about. It's so easy to go into tangents. He's doing this thing where he's saying, what the heck are we doing? Now, the alternative theory for what we're doing with art and why we care about it is that it's nothing more than entertainment. It's a diversion. It's just enjoyable. That's the other theory, the analytical philosophical tradition, the people inclined against the existentialist approach. And you can see he's even saying, look how scary this is, that this is the case. I mean, the future will be determined by by the artists we have, by a bunch of pot-smoking morons who don't have much of an idea of what the hell they're even doing. They are the ones that are blindly speculating out in the realms where we haven't quite figured anything out, and then that's where we will be moving in the future. It's like, yeah, there's a reason why some people have an instinct to say, no, let's ignore that. Let's just stick with what we already know. But the problem is you can't stick with what you already know, because what you know is insufficient. I don't mean to insult the artist, because he's doing quite a good job of saying, no, this is some fantastic stuff that's being done here. And yeah, there's a lot of bad science. That doesn't mean that the great science isn't great. And sure, there's a lot of nonsense art perhaps, but we live off the great stuff. And, you know, if you look at, he says, I'm in a room with 20 paintings and I estimated the room was worth $1 billion, right? That's 20 paintings. 20 important paintings make a room worth $1 billion. Okay, so however much money we put into the electronic infrastructure, all of the energy we're putting into it, all of the time, the programs that are being written, the vast, ridiculous armies of people that are involved in replacing poles and coming up with new technology and driving trucks out to run new lines and have, teams of designers and surveyors and everything that has to go into constantly maintaining all of the energy that we go into putting 100,000 people on the power grid every day who weren't there yesterday, who can now boil water on an electric stove, who couldn't do it the day before, which is what we're doing in the world. That's a lot of energy and it's a lot of value. It's a drop in the bucket compared to how much money and energy and value we as a society place in architecture and in flying across the world just to go stand in a museum and stare at a statue of David or Venus and say, I can't even explain to you why I find this valuable, but I'm kind of dumbstruck and I just want to stare at this for a while. So it's weird in a couple of ways. One, it's much more value than all of the money that goes into things that we would at first say, well, I can see the practical purpose for that. But secondly, even the people who are valuing it can't give a verbal account for what it is they're even doing, right? I mean, yeah, we fly across the world and we go stand in front of a statue, but every day we're downloading another movie. We're watching Mel Gibson fight an enemy. We're watching Tom Cruise struggle to do something. It's like, what the heck? With all of Hollywood, all of this production, all of these teams and armies of people, all to tell an hour and a half long story and to then immediately start working on the next one while there's a whole bunch of other people working on other ones all the time. It's like, this is without us being able to account for it, even as a species. The Jungian types are saying, why don't we zoom out for a minute and look at what weird kind of creatures we are? And maybe there's a kind of evidence that there's something really valuable in this way of thinking and talking. Now, we remember Peterson is setting the stage for saying, okay, if you think the Bible is an old dusty book that doesn't really matter, or if you think it's all that matters because it's very straightforward, objective language, it's just going to tell you the facts that you're supposed to repeat and what church to go to so that you have a good afterlife or something. If that's how you're evaluating the value of the Bible, it's because you're in a post-Cartesian scientism world, as I keep calling it, but you're in this world where we don't understand where real, deep, profound value comes from. When you walk into a cathedral or into a castle, the architecture it counts as art. Why? Because you're dumbfounded and it's shouting at you from every direction in this three-dimensional space. Every time you take a step, you're looking at a new facet of that three-dimensional space, and every part of it is shouting at you, this is who you are in relation to the cosmos and the body politic, depending on if it's a cathedral or a castle, like a political building. Either way, it's been structured in a way that is shouting truth at you that you can't put into words or explain why it feels so important. So these existentialists and these Jungians, these children of Nietzsche who are coming in and exploring this way of thinking, they're saying, okay, it might be that at the base of reality is something like whatever lives ultimately in the dream world. That ways of being are depicted there and nothing else. It doesn't follow physical laws. It doesn't follow temporal spatial laws. It's just about a kind of a person, personalities, and they're interacting with each other and they're at war with each other. They're cooperating with each other. You can get to know them you only get to know them since their personalities through narrative structures. So your dreams give you narratives that are trying to tell you something about yourself and what it is that you need to be concerned with as far as other personal forces in the world, whether they be other people or principles of maternity and paternity or relationships, spousal and generational relationships or political relationships and all of these things, or the divine and how you relate to that and nature itself. So they're talking to you about yourself as what you know yourself to be. And if you run the personal experiment, you say, no, I feel like a Terminator robot. I think I might just be an NPC. Well, that's fine. Then just ignore all this. It won't mean anything to you. But if that's not what it feels like to be you, if it feels like you're in a tragedy or a comedy or a great hero story and you're not sure how to move forward, this is the language for addressing you as that. And so he's setting the stage for approaching the Bible by saying, look, I'm not saying this is the only way to read the Bible. I'm saying if you don't understand that that's how powerful narrative can be, and then you say, okay, well, maybe Shakespeare is the 1 in 10 million dreamer, but maybe the people who wrote religious, revelatory, scriptural texts, like prophetic narratives, maybe they're the Shakespeares of the Shakespeares. And maybe they're just profoundly able to get flashes of insight about what is really, 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 really ultimately true on a subject level. And if that's possible, maybe we can approach these stories with a little bit of humility and a little bit of curiosity rather than dismissing it as something we're imagining ourselves to think more scientifically than we do. And then we're imagining that anything that isn't engaged in that objectivist fantasy is somehow worthless by definition. It's like we could be throwing out the baby and sucking up the bathwater. Like it's like the worst thing we could be doing in our society. And these existentialists are advocating, let's throw an anchor into the ocean. Let's start going in and looking for something in that realm and finding rules and principles for how to navigate it and how to get maybe not extracted truths that we can put in propositional form, but maybe we can at least learn how to navigate the profound meaning and truth that might come from these things rather than dismissing it. Or the one side is the dismissing it from the atheist side, but the other side from the religious side is idolizing it, like making a cartoon version out of it, like it was about a simple fact and not about who you are as a person and about love and relationship to the divine and that sort of a thing, wrestling with God properly, so to speak. So he's doing all of this because he needs to, because we are in this crazy post-Cartesian space where we just have this fantasy that there's some way that we could be outside the universe and pretend to look at it objectively, but we're in the universe and we can't really have that perspective. And also what an insult to the depth and nobility of what we actually are to try to reduce ourselves in that way to something that could be so cartoonish. Science is powerful, but it's a simplification of what's true. It can't possibly, therefore, be the ultimate truth. Maybe this narrative thing can't either, but maybe it can. It doesn't immediately suffer from that same problem of necessarily being based on an unattainable fiction. Okay, so I'm going to stop my nonsense right now, and let's just get into this very interesting example where he's going to try to explore. And again, one of the things that makes it so powerful listening to Peterson is that he's on the cutting edge, right? He's trying to find the words for explaining the thing he's sort of feeling out. And there's a lot of reasons why it's insanely valuable to listen to Peterson and why I'm really thrilled that we're going to go through all of this content of his together and talk about it. But one of the reasons why is that he's actually living this. He's actually wrestling with it in real time. It's not like he said, I've got the formula. Here's the bullet points on my PowerPoint presentation. These are the truths. No, the truths are too profound for something that can be reduced to something like that. So he's acting out. He's actually embodying the true manifestation of being the type of person who's wrestling with truths that you don't ever get to own. And so let's see him do that now. We'll end it while watching him do that with an exploratory attempt to explain the meaning and potential truth that can come from music as an art.
With it, because reality is patterned and deeply patterned in layers. And so I think music is representing reality in some fundamental way, and that we get into the sway of that and sort of participate in being. And that's part of what makes it such an uplifting experience. But we don't really know that's what we're doing. We just go do it. And it's nourishing for people, right? I mean, young people in particular, lots of them live for music. It's where they derive all their meaning, their cultural identity. Everything that's nourishing comes from their affiliation with their music. That is part of their cultural identity. So that's an amazing thing. The question still remains, where does the information in dreams come from? And I think where it comes from is that we watch the patterns that everyone acts out. We've watched that forever, and we've got some representations of those patterns. That's part of our cultural history. That's what's embedded in stories, in fictional accounts of the story between good and evil, the bad guy and the good guy, and the romance. These are canonical patterns of being for people, and they deeply affect us because they represent what it is that we will act out in the world. And then we flesh that out with the individual information we have about ourselves and other people. And so it's like there's waves of behavioral patterns that manifest themselves in the crowd across time. The great dramas are played on the crowd across time. And the artists watch that, and and they get intimations of what that is, and they write it down and they tell us, and then we're a little clearer about what we're up to. You know, like a great dramatist like Shakespeare, let's say, we know that what he wrote is fiction, and then we say, well, fiction isn't true. But then you think, well, wait a minute, maybe it's like numbers are true. You know, numbers are an abstraction from the underlying reality, but no mind would really think numbers aren't true. You could even make a case that the numbers are more real than the things that they represent, right? Because the abstraction is so insanely powerful. Once you have mathematics, you're just deadly. You can move the world with mathematics. And so it's not obvious that the abstraction is less real than the more concrete reality. And you take a work of fiction like Hamlet, and you think, well, is that, it's not true because it's fiction. But then you think, wait a minute, what kind of explanation is that? Like maybe it's more true than nonfiction, because it takes what the story that needs to be told about you and the story that needs to be told about you and you and you and you, and abstracts that out and says, look, here's something that's a key part of the human experience as such, right? So it's an abstraction from this underlying noisy substrate, and people are affected by it because they see that the thing that's represented is part of the pattern of their being. That's the right way to think about it. And then with these old stories, these ancient stories, it seems to me like that process has been occurring for thousands of years. It's like we watched ourselves and we extracted out some stories. We imitated each other and we represented that in drama, and then we distilled the drama and we got a representation of the distillation, and then we did it again. And at the end of that process, it took God only knows how long. I think some of these stories, they've traced fairy tales back 10,000 years, some fairy tales, in relatively unchanged form. And it certainly seems to me that the archaeological evidence, for example, suggests that the really old stories that the Bible begins with are at least that old and likely embedded in a prehistory that's far older than that. And you might think, well, how can you be so sure? And the answer to that in part is that cultures that don't change, like the ancient cultures, right? They didn't change as fast as this. They stay the same. That's the answer. So they keep their information moving generation to generation. That's how they stay the same. And so we know, again, in the archaeological.
Let's pause here because he's just starting a pretty big point, and what we'll do is we'll pick up at the beginning of that point again next week. We've decided to limit this to an hour and a half, and so we've only got 6 minutes left. So we'll rewind about 20 seconds, and then we'll start again from there next week. Two things. Peterson is, so we had a discussion after class, after the recording, and we're going to have part of that discussion again right now, which is, what the heck is Peterson up to? It's like if somebody said, I'm a professor, I'm an intellectual, and I want to talk about the Bible. It's like, okay, you could be up to all sorts of things. You might be pretending to have more credentials academically than you do, and you just really want to talk about the Bible. Okay, maybe that's not Peterson, clearly. Why do you keep talking about Nietzsche and Jung and evolutionary biology and all of this science stuff at the same time? Like, I thought we were going to talk about the Bible. So what is it that you're up to? And what's really funny about Peterson is when he first started, I was like, oh yeah, this is exciting. And I realized right away that the atheistic types are going to think he's a fundamentalist Christian and just won't admit it. And the fundamentalist Christian types are going to think he's an atheist and just won't admit it. And that's a really good sign. When that's a good sign that a person's actually a thinker, because when all of the NPCs from both sides are inclined to distrust you, it's a sign that you might actually be saying something, which of course he's saying quite a lot. He said a little bit about how he approaches things. He said, I want a rational and empirical answer for things before I look for any other type of answer. That's an interesting standard. I had said last time in the after show, I had said in answer to one of these questions about sort of what his approach is and where he's coming from, I said, look, it was pretty clear to me early on that he thinks there is, no, that's not the right way to say it. I'm sorry. Hold on. He's put on the line He's put his chips on, living as if there are profound, meaningful truths to be found from a revelatory source that he better get in line with or live according to or wrestle with. Let's just say wrestle with. That he took religion more seriously than most religious people and even most atheists who take it quite seriously too. Um, but he's doing it in that way that we talked about. I'm not sure, it was probably not part of the record, but if that embodied way, right? Like, evidence that I believe the chair will hold me exists when I sit in it. And no matter how much I talk about the chair being well built, if I refuse to sit in it, there's reason to suspect that I don't believe it will hold me, kind of a thing. So it's like the monkey believes he can reach the branch when he jumps out of the tree with his arm extended. How do you know the monkey has a belief? Because he jumped, right? The jump is the belief in a sense. So he's looking at life as if we have to make jumps. He's looking at life as if the way to jump and land properly is to be oriented properly towards the right things. And that the language he's suggesting in the preface to this, getting into the Bible stories, the language that could be meaningful to us in helping us figure out if we're aimed at the right thing or just slightly off, or aimed in the opposite direction and thinking it's up when it's really down, or whatever else needs to be said to us on this wild and crazy journey of trying to sort out all these complicated sub personalities that we're not even aware of. Again, like you said, seeming to have more control over us than we have over them in pretty wild ways. Like it's hinted at the dream. You don't make up the dream, and yet clearly it's made up by something, and it's made up by you, but it's not you. It's telling you things that you didn't know. So it's like there's things going on here that are higher than we are in a sense, and they're sewn into us. Possibly. So he wants to explore all of that. That was the Jungian invitation, is let's go swimming out into the middle of the deepest ocean. That's what Nietzsche was talking about when he said your roots have to go down to the deepest abyss if you want your heights to grow to the highest heights. And I think Peterson, Jung said something similar, but they're all children of Nietzsche in a sense. And Nietzsche had said that in the fourth book of Zarathustra. And so in any case, it's a scary thing. Right? He's acknowledging that it's scary 3 or 4 times in just this clip, the short clips we've listened to today. It's like, hey, we're about to jump into the ocean. We're not on solid ground. We're not going to have, well-defined walls inside. We are going out into the wilderness. We're speculating out into the dark forest where nothing's been cleared and there's no clear roads and rules and buildings and anything. We are going out where there are leviathans and dragons, and you might not make it. Like, we are going into the realm of nightmares and the realm of dreams. And if you're a scientist, you might, or an analytical philosopher, you might say, no, I'm going to stay here where I know what words mean. That'd be a nice place to start if I'm going to argue and use propositions to try to get to the truth. Let's just stay here. But the Jungians and the Nietzscheans, the existentialists, these guys understood that, no, you only have words that mean something because we've cleared out some ground. And those words are based in things that go deeper than we've even figured out. And we have to keep playing this game and keep pushing, or else it's going to dry up and die, which incidentally is what the old myths say. And we'll be able to look at those in these lectures from Peterson. He's going to talk about some of those myths which say that. So we won't talk about it right now. But there's another reason to not go out there, which is to have a religious attitude. So it's not just about the scientismists, which Nietzsche thought were a sub-denomination of Christianity, by the way. But it's not just that cult that says, no, I'm too afraid to go out there. But it's also the religious people who say, I've got the truth. I own it. My doctrines are correct. I took a class, an apologetics class, and we looked at the eschatology, and we looked at the scriptures. And when I read this scripture, I know what it means. It means something very simple in words. It's not about stories. It's not about personalities. It's not about me actually wrestling with God. It's just, here's the fact, and you say this, and then you're in the right club, and you eat this cookie, and you say Jesus's name in the right way, and everything's settled. It's like, well, it feels really comfortable to think that. And hopefully that's all true, and that's wonderful. But the stories themselves in the Bible are not like that. They're actually saying you got to wrestle with God to try to get a blessing. They're saying, Christ said, get away from me. I never knew you. It's about knowing, like Adam knew his wife kind of knowledge. It's like many will come in that day and say, Lord, Lord, did we not cast out demons, heal the sick, raise the dead, and do it in your name? It's like we were saying it was Jesus, and this is the truth. He said, go away. You've never wrestled with me. You don't know me in that personal relationship kind of a way. And the stories were about that. In other words, the Tao that you can speak is not the true Tao, right? The idea that I can say all the right things and sign my name to the right doctrines. A God impressed by that is not a God worth worshiping. But the God of the Bible is not depicted as a God who would be impressed by that. His challenge is that you are in a much more serious and dangerous and precarious position than that. You are on a hero's journey, and hell is on one side and heaven is on the other, and everything's at stake. So the Bible's going to talk to us that way. Why don't we approach one of the ways of summing up some of this is say, well, let's approach the ancient mythopoetic narratives. At least they're trying to talk to us that way. Let's approach them with the not legitimate, what's the word I'm looking for? The appropriate level of seriousness. And that takes a lot of this prefacing because of the age we live in of clarifying. No, there's other languages besides this objectivist language, and that objectivist language doesn't, it might not be higher. And in fact, it's impossible of being the ultimate. So let's learn how to read stories properly. Let's approach stories properly. And let's realize that that might be more real than if it was just a simple list of facts or doctrines you're supposed to say you believe or something like that. So let's pause there. That's a great place to pause. I'll rewind a few seconds. I'll go and look at it and write the time down for it so that we can start this next big point of his next time. So uh, wrapping up, we are going to do it this way at this time. I'm putting together a calendar of all our classes. This is some year 3 stuff where we get really into some heavy stuff. Most of the classes we're doing now are year 1 stuff, but I'll be releasing a calendar soon with all of our classes. And the way we do this one is a small group of people, and we just hit pause anytime we feel like there's something to talk about. Now, last time we did this, I ended the stream and then everybody asked a bunch of really great questions. So we had a really good conversation. I'm going to ask if it's possible, Mark or Elena, if you have any questions. Oh, I should have wrapped up what I was going to say about that. So Peterson is saying he wants a rational and empirical answer before he looks for any other kind of answer. And he's sort of coming up with a story here. Did you notice where he says, well, we've been looking at the way we behave for so long that it's sort of being written into us. And then all of a sudden we have a dream and then we have a flash of inspiration. And then you write the 10 Commandments or something like that, which it's more than that, but you write a story and whatever. However, that's so here's what I meant to say earlier when I was examining Peterson's approach. Peterson is examining, he wants to explore these great depths, and then he wants to speak in a defensible way inside of academic circles about it. And he's really, really impressive. He's really impressive at doing that. So if you're trying to nail down, that was the question from last time. It's like, you know, what's this guy about? It's that he is trying to find the truths rather than claiming to own them. He's completely finding from the existentialist and Jungian side of things, the Nietzschean child that he is, completely appropriate to look for truth in things that are very, very different in deep oceans compared to the types of places that we'd like to cartoonify and restrict ourselves. But also he's looking to articulate it. He's looking to say, I'm looking for something that I can't wrap my head around, and try to wrap my head around it and try to say it's sort of like this so that I can defend it in the appropriate way, which is through conversation and of propositional form and in an academic setting. So it's really admirable, and he's doing both of those at the same time. And so we'll leave it there, but I'd hate to end this stream and then have a bunch of really awesome questions be asked and have a bunch of really awesome discussions. So if anybody has the nerve to just say something you're curious about or confused about, or you want to talk about before I end it, maybe we'll keep it in the recording. Otherwise, I'll end it and we might talk about it afterwards. Okay, we'll end the stream and we'll go into our after show conversation. Thank you guys so much.